Ricardo Montoya, a man in his early 40s, was the embodiment of law and order in Los Angeles. His black hair, once thick and without a single silver strand, now displayed discreet gray streaks at the temples, silent witnesses to years of service and sleepless nights. His tanned skin, marked by expression lines around his brown eyes, told the story of an unforgiving sun and countless hours under the Californian sky. His physique, though not athletic, was robust, with broad shoulders that seemed to carry the weight not only of his bulletproof vest, but also of the expectations of a community and a family. The impeccably pressed navy blue uniform was a symbol of his identity, a shield that separated him from the chaos he swore to combat. Morally, Ricardo was a pillar of conservatism. He firmly believed in traditional values, hard work, respect for authority, and the importance of family. For him, the law was the law, and order had to be maintained at all costs. Raised in a home of Mexican immigrants who struggled to build a dignified life in the United States, Ricardo internalized the idea that obedience and conformity were the keys to success and acceptance. He saw himself as an example of successful integration, a man who, despite his roots, had earned his place in American society through merit and dedication. This belief, however, was an armor that protected him from deeper questions about his own identity and his family's place in a country that, at times, seemed to celebrate their contribution while denying their full citizenship. Psychologically, Ricardo was a man of unshakable convictions, or so he thought. His mind worked linearly, seeking practical and direct solutions to problems. The complexity of social issues, especially those related to immigration and racial justice, was something he preferred to approach through the lens of the law, avoiding emotional and historical nuances. He prided himself on his resilience and his ability to remain calm under pressure, essential characteristics for his profession. However, behind the facade of unwavering determination, there was a growing unease. The protests sweeping the city, his son's words, the newspaper headlines, all of it began to erode the foundations of his certainties, planting seeds of doubt in ground he considered solid and unquestionable. His loyalty to the corporation, to the country, and to his own worldview was about to be tested in a way he never imagined. Mateo Montoya, in his early 20s, was the vibrant opposite of his father, Ricardo. His hair, also black, was long and untamed, framing a young face with accentuated Latino features, inherited from generations of Mexican ancestors. His eyes, an intense and penetrating brown, gleamed with a passion and idealism that Ricardo had perhaps forgotten or suppressed over the years. Lean, but with a contained energy that seemed ready to explode at any moment, Mateo preferred simple, comfortable clothes, band t-shirts, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers that sharply contrasted with his father's impeccable uniform. A discreet cactus tattoo on his forearm was a small yet significant reminder of his roots and his resilience. Morally, Mateo was a fierce idealist, a passionate advocate for social justice and human rights. He didn't see the world in black and white, but in a myriad of shades of gray, where laws were not always just and order did not always serve everyone. For him, blind obedience was a form of complicity with oppression. Raised hearing the stories of sacrifice from his grandparents and seeing the difficulties faced by his own community, Mateo felt an undeniable call to fight against injustices. He believed that true change would only come through direct action and the collective voice of the oppressed. His morality was guided by an internal compass of empathy and solidarity, which propelled him to put himself on the front lines, even if it meant confronting those he loved. The protests were not just a way to express anger, but a manifestation of hope, a cry for a more just and equitable future.
Los Angeles, a metropolis of stark contrasts, simmered under a relentless summer sun. But it wasn't the usual heat that suffocated the city. It was the tension, palpable in the air, that thickened with each passing day. The hands-off, 50501, and No Kings protests had erupted like a dormant volcano, spreading through the streets and avenues, transforming squares and corners into stages of indignation. What began as murmurs of discontent, amplified by social media and accumulated frustration, turned into a deafening chorus of voices demanding to be heard. The city, known for its glamour and Hollywood illusions, now revealed its rawest face, that of a divided society where the promise of the American dream seemed increasingly distant for many. Ricardo Montoya felt the weight of this effervescence in every fiber of his being. In the passenger seat of the patrol car, the radio crackled with the frequency of emergency calls, each a reminder of the growing disorder. He observed the streets, once familiar, now unrecognizable under the haze of tear gas and the graffiti adorning walls and facades. For him, this was an attack on the very structure of society, a threat to the order he had dedicated his life to protecting. With each demonstration, each confrontation, the line between right and wrong, between law and anarchy seemed to blur a little more. He clung to his unwavering faith in the system, in the belief that in the end, reason would prevail, and peace would be restored. But deep down, a voice whispered doubts, a dissonant melody that echoed the words of his son, Mateo. Mateo, in turn, was at the epicenter of the hurricane. For him, the streets of Los Angeles were not a battlefield, but a sanctuary, a space where the voice of the marginalized finally found an echo. He marched side by side with hundreds, thousands of people, their fists raised in defiance, their voices hoarse from shouting slogans. The energy was contagious, a mix of hope and fury. He was on the front lines, alongside his fellow activists, ready to face whatever came. The City Hall, imposing in the distance, was the symbol of the power they challenged, and with each step, Mateo's determination grew stronger. He knew his father was on the other side of the barricade, but the conviction of his cause was stronger than the fear of disapproval or even confrontation. Days turned into weeks, and the intensity of the protests in Los Angeles only increased. Hands Off, which began as a cry against family separation at the border, expanded to embrace indignation against anti-immigrant rhetoric and police raids in Latino neighborhoods. 50501, a veiled reference to a law many considered discriminatory, became the anthem of resistance against excessive surveillance and the criminalization of entire communities. And No Kings, once a whisper of discontent, now echoed through the streets as a clamor for autonomy and the end of a government that seemed to ignore the voices of its own people. Ricardo Montoya felt the pressure from all sides. At work, the hours were exhausting, confrontations more frequent, and the line between protesters and vandals increasingly blurred. His colleagues, many with the same conservative view, reinforced the narrative that the protests were a threat to public safety, an act of disrespect for the law. He participated in planning meetings, listened to containment orders, and saw frustration grow among officers. However, at home, the reality was different. Discussions with Mateo became more frequent and heated. His son, once a young man he saw as a bit idealistic, now seemed like a stranger, a radical who challenged everything he believed. He tried to argue, citing the need for order, the importance of following rules, but Mateo passionately countered, speaking about rights, injustice, and the hypocrisy of a system that promised equality but delivered discrimination. One night, after a particularly violent day of clashes, Ricardo arrived home exhausted. The television was on, showing images of protesters being dispersed with tear gas. Mateo was in the living room, his eyes fixed on the screen, an expression of pain and anger on his face. "They are attacking our people, Dad," he exclaimed, his voice choked. Ricardo, tired, tried to deflect. "They are breaking the law, Mateo. They are vandalizing, putting lives at risk." Lives at risk? What about the lives destroyed every day by this government's policies? Families separated, parents deported, young people with no future. Isn't that putting lives at risk? The discussion dragged on, and Ricardo, for the first time, felt a deep discomfort. Mateo's words, though painful, resonated with a truth he had tried to ignore for so long. He remembered the stories of his own parents, the sacrifices they made, the humiliations they endured. The image of his father, a dignified and hard-working man, being treated as a second-class citizen, began to overlap with his idealized vision of America. The dilemma deepened. Loyalty to the badge versus loyalty to his own heritage, to his own flesh and blood. The armor of his convictions began to crack, and the weight of the badge felt heavier than ever.
Mateo Montoya was not just a protester. He was a driving force, a tireless organizer. He spent his days and nights on the streets, not just shouting slogans, but also distributing water, providing first aid to the injured, and documenting police brutality with his cell phone. He connected with other young activists, exchanging ideas, planning strategies, and strengthening the network of solidarity. For him, every protest was a lesson, every confrontation a learning experience. He learned to move within the crowd, to anticipate police movements, to protect the most vulnerable. Adrenaline coursed through his veins, mixed with a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. He felt he was in the right place, doing the right thing, even if it put him on a collision course with his own father. The news, once a source of irritation for Ricardo, now became a distorted mirror of his own life. He saw images of young Latinos on the front lines, their faces blurred by smoke, their eyes full of defiance. And, although he never saw Mateo clearly, the silhouette, the energy, the passion, all of it reminded him of his son. With each report on police repression, a knot formed in his stomach. He heard his colleagues' comments, the jokes about these vandals and these people who don't want to work, and felt a chill. The words, once acceptable, now sounded hollow, laden with a prejudice that he, in his conservative bubble, had ignored for so long. Mateo's struggle, which he initially saw as youthful rebellion, began to transform in his eyes, taking on the contours of a battle for dignity, for recognition. Ricardo's dilemma intensified daily. He found himself torn between duty and conscience. The oath he took to the corporation, his loyalty to his colleagues, his belief in the law, all of this weighed on one side. On the other, Mateo's voice, his parents' stories, the growing realization that the country he loved and served so much might never have fully accepted him despite his efforts. He began to question orders, to see situations from a different angle. When his superiors spoke of crowd control, he thought of scared and angry people. When they spoke of restoring order, he thought of silencing voices. The facade of the unshakable police officer began to crumble, revealing a man tormented by doubts, a father who feared for his son's future and for the future of his own soul. The city, in its chaos, was forcing Ricardo to confront uncomfortable truths, to see the cracks in the foundation of his beliefs. And he knew that the final confrontation, the moment of truth, was inevitably approaching. June 30th, 2025 dawned with suffocating heat. But it wasn't just the temperature that made the air dense in Los Angeles. Rumors of a large protest, the biggest yet, circulated through the city. Social media buzzed with calls for a massive march towards City Hall, a final act of defiance against the policies that so afflicted the immigrant community. Ricardo Montoya had a bad feeling. The tension in police briefings was palpable, orders stricter, the expectation of imminent confrontation. He put on his uniform with a heavy heart, each piece feeling heavier than usual. Mateo, on the other hand, was electric. This was the day everyone had been waiting for, the moment to show the movement's strength. He joined the crowd gathering in the streets, a human tide of voices and signs. The energy was contagious, a mix of hope and fury. He was on the front lines, alongside his fellow activists, ready to face whatever came. City Hall, imposing in the distance, was the symbol of the power they challenged. And with each step, Mateo's determination grew stronger. The march advanced,
encountering police barriers at every corner. Confrontation was inevitable. Tear gas filled the air. The sound of flashbangs echoed, and the crowd, once united, began to disperse amidst the chaos. Ricardo was in the middle of the containment line, his face covered by a gas mask, his eyes burning not only from smoke but from the pain of seeing the city in flames. He and his unit advanced, pushing back protesters, arresting those who resisted. It was a war scene, and Ricardo, a soldier of the law, acted on instinct, following orders, trying to hold the line. Suddenly, amidst the smoke and shouts, Ricardo saw a familiar face, Mateo. His son was there, just a few feet away, his eyes red and watery, yet still defiant. He held a crumpled sign with the phrase, "No Kings," and was trying to help an elderly woman who had fallen. Ricardo's heart leaped, a mix of dread and despair. He wanted to shout, he wanted to run to him, but duty held him back. The order was clear: arrest all who resisted, all who were considered vandals. A colleague of Ricardo's, a younger, more impetuous officer, advanced towards Mateo. "Stop! You're under arrest," he shouted, grabbing Mateo's arm. Ricardo's son resisted, not with violence, but with a silent stubbornness, his eyes fixed on his father's. Ricardo felt his blood run cold. He saw Mateo's expression, a mix of surprise and betrayal, and knew his son had recognized him. The world seemed to stop. The noise of the crowd, the shouts, the sirens, all became a distant hum. Only Mateo's eyes mattered, questioning, accusing, pleading. Ricardo had a choice. He could intervene, risk his career, his reputation, to protect his son. Or he could follow orders, arrest Mateo, and hand him over to the National Guard, like so many others. The dilemma that had tormented him for weeks now materialized before him, in flesh and blood, in the form of his own son. Loyalty to the badge, to the corporation, to the country, violently collided with paternal love, with the newfound understanding of his own identity and the injustices his community faced. Sweat ran down his forehead, mixing with tears he didn't know if they were from smoke or despair. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity, as Ricardo Montoya, the conservative police officer, the Latino father, faced the most difficult decision of his life. Time, which had previously dragged, suddenly accelerated. Ricardo's colleague, impatient, pulled Mateo with more force. Ricardo felt a heat rise through his body, a fury not directed at his son, but at the system that put them in that situation. In an instant, a decision was made, not with the logical mind of the police officer, but with the heart of the father. He stepped forward, his hand firmly on his colleague's shoulder. "Let him go," Ricardo said, his voice deep and firm, surprising himself and the other officer. "But sir, he was resisting. What about the other vandals?" Ricardo stared at him, his brown eyes conveying an authority that brooked no questions. "I said, I'll handle him. And the others. We don't need to escalate the tension unnecessarily. We need a different approach here." There was something in Ricardo's voice, a newfound conviction, that made the colleague back off, releasing Mateo. His son, still stunned, looked at his father, a mix of relief and incomprehension on his face. Then Ricardo did something he never imagined. He turned to the dispersed crowd, to the few protesters who were still around, and raised his hands, not in threat, but in a gesture of appeasement. "Go home," he said, his voice amplified by a colleague's megaphone. "Violence won't solve anything, but your voices need to be heard. Go home, but don't be silent." It was an improvised speech, coming from a deep place within him, a place he had suppressed for years. He knew he was breaking protocol, that he was risking everything, but at that moment, Mateo's truth, the truth of his own heritage, was stronger than any rule. He took Mateo by the arm, not with the force of a police officer arresting a criminal, but with the firmness of a father guiding his son. "Let's go home, Mateo," he whispered. As they moved away from the chaos, Ricardo felt the weight of the badge lessen, replaced by a new kind of weight, the weight of responsibility for a truth he had finally embraced. He knew the consequences would be severe. He would be questioned, perhaps suspended, or even fired. But for the first time in a long time, he felt an inner peace, a clarity that conservatism and blind obedience could never give him. In the Los Angeles, the sun continued to shine. But now, for Ricardo and Mateo, it seemed to illuminate a new dawn, a dawn of understanding, reconciliation, and, above all, hope. If you enjoyed this story, please consider giving it a like and subscribing for more compelling narratives. Your support helps us create more content like this.